Welcome to the Metropolitan Campus this evening. I'm Joseph Kiernan. I am your Metropolitan Campus Provost, and it's a pleasure to welcome you. Tonight we start the 14th year of the UN Pathways program. The program began in 2001, and in that time over 50 ambassadors and other distinguished guests from the United Nations have come to our campus, usually 2 each semester, to engage in a dialogue or a discussion of issues and things that are going on in their country, their part of the world, or in this case, the whole world. I won't wait too long to get this going, but tonight we are pleased to welcome Mr. George Kell. And Mr. Kell is the Executive Director of the United Nations Global Compact. That doesn't make him ambassador of anywhere, except that he is someone that is very concerned with some very important issues to all of us from all around the world. So this evening, I'd be remiss if I didn't stop and say, if your cell phones are on, turn them off. No phone calls during the discussion. Okay. So this evening's program will consist of a dialogue between Professor Jason Scorza, who is our Vice Provost for Academic and International Affairs. Jason's office, the Office of Global Learning, supervises international education on campus, and the UN Pathways program is part of what they do. So the program will entail a dialogue between Professor Scorza and Mr. Kell. There are about 45 minutes or so. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. And then some of you will join us a little later for the dinner. So with that, I'll turn the festivities over to Dr. Scorza, who will take it from here. So thank you and welcome, everyone.
Thank you very much, Provost Kiernan. And thank all of you for being with us here tonight for the first installment of the Fall 2014 UN Pathways series. We are very grateful and excited to have a return visitor to Fairleigh Dickinson University, Mr. George Kell, who was with us several years ago on the Florham campus to talk about the work of the Global Compact and the significance of corporate social responsibility. And we are going to bring us up to date on what's been going on in those areas. And then, as Provost Kiernan said, open the floor to your questions and comments. To begin with, I'd like to invite you, Mr. Kell, to make a few remarks about the Global Compact. Many of us have heard of it, of course, but we may not know very much about how it got started and what its primary work is.
Well, thank you, Jason. And first of all, thanks to FDU for having me here. This is a great place, well known in New York at the United Nations for its dedication to the issues that are so dear to so many people around the world. There are many very good interfaces, so it's a real privilege to be here at FDU again after, I believe, 7 or 8 years. And the UN Global Compact is a child of what you could call the modern age of globalization. It was born in the late 90s when the need became clear that as business has gone global, while governments remained local, that there are important gaps out there in the social domain, on the environmental domain, which, if left unfilled, would feed into a backlash against openness, against a commitment to a rule-based integration. In the late 90s, there was this huge outburst of we can connect. Remember, this was before 9/11, before the clash of civilization. There was, generally speaking, a very positive outlook on the future. And if I think back, it was one of these rare opportunities also where the United Nations was really at the center stage of driving some of these processes. WTO just came into existence. China just joined the WTO. Yet there were deep concerns that human rights, environmental issues, and social issues were neglected, and which, if left unaddressed, would lead rightly to a backlash and would actually undermine the whole concept of openness and connectivity around the world. So that was why the Global Compact idea was born in the late 90s. I was given the job by my former boss, Kofi Annan, in cooperation with John Ruggie, to come up with a great speech. And Kofi Annan said, if the speech is not great, then I don't go to the World Economic Forum. So, and I was given quite some time to work on that. And we chose then principles that meet 3 criteria. First, they are relevant for business. We also looked opportunistically with business under pressure, sweatshop campaigns and so forth. We looked for principles which could be derived from soft law, frameworks that already are legitimized by the international community. So these principles don't come out of thin air, but they are supported by a deeper bedrock of soft law and international frameworks. And thirdly, of course, was the universality of the whole concept. It has to be applicable everywhere, for large, for small companies, and so forth. And it had to be relevant to the ongoing discourse of where we stood. So this is how the Global Compact idea came together, basically as an opportunistic construct of the United Nations to insert itself in the globalization debate and offering a solution to the social clause, which was a big issue in the Seattle WTO context, but also as a pragmatic way to genuinely build values into markets to make them simply sustainable and inclusive. And what has the UN to offer? If you look back in its history, one of its most solid building blocks are the Declaration of Human Rights. It's one of the most influential documents ever drafted on this globe, in modern times at least. The fundamental principles and rights at work, they are supported by, at least in theory, by all countries. Environmental principles that came out of the Rio conference and other big conferences, the recognition that there are resource constraints and limitations. And we added then in the year 2004 a 10th principle against corruption, once there was a convention against corruption. We knew about the importance of corruption from the beginning, but we couldn't come up with a principle out of thin air. We had to wait until there was a convention signed by member states and endorsed. So this speaks to the legitimacy of the principles, so to speak. So initially the idea was simply to do a great speech for the boss, which it was. It made the front lines of the New York Times, Financial Times, and the boss was very happy. And we were very happy, and we wanted to go home up to the next policy speech. That's the true story. But then CEOs, ambassadors, ministers approached Kofi Annan and said, look, great speech, make it an initiative, a reality. And that's where the real journey started, building a global operational initiative built on this lofty idea of shared values, inclusive, sustainable global marketplace. And I will fast forward now, because the last 15 years have been an enormous effort in network building and engagement, and the Global Compact works as follows. CEOs are challenged individually to take a public stand on the 10 principles, to commit to their implementation, and to make this known to their employees and value chain. And there's a really serious commitment that comes with it. Once a year, communicate on progress, on how the implementation of this commitment is advancing. We also invite all corporate participants to take action on UN goals in the area of peace, of development, climate change, or related issues. So the double challenge to business is make the principles part of your organizational DNA, integrate them into strategy and operations, and at the same time be open to partnerships, to collaboration, support approaches and initiatives that tackle problems that affect you but also society. And that basic philosophy has not changed. It's the same today, 15 years onwards. What has changed is the number of participants and the network infrastructure and the issue knowledge behind it. And let me just update you very quickly. Today, there are 8,000 active corporate participants. By active, we mean those who also disclose on a regular basis. We already had to delist 4,000 corporate participants for failure to disclose annual progress, meaning they sign on, but then they don't follow through. It hurts, by the way, because recruiting them is quite an effort, and then they drop out for failure to disclose. We have currently 100 80 up and running country networks, some of them quite big. They almost have national prominence. Some of them are celebrating their 10th anniversary this year, quite influential in national agenda setting. We have 8 global issue platforms, as we call them. With issue platforms, we define thematic approaches where business and other stakeholders engage with the shared interest of making improvements on children causes, women empowerment, caring for climate, CO water mandate, anti-corruption, business for peace, to mention the most important platforms. And the idea of the platform is that business increasingly sees the benefits of collaborating on shared challenges. So that modus operandi hasn't changed. So we are in essence just a network builder, the infrastructure provider, and if you so want, the convener for dialogue and learning. More than 200 guidance documents have been developed with stakeholders over the last 15 years, covering a huge area of issues, some of them very, very technical and specific. Just yesterday, we released the world's first guidance on how to measure and report on water consumption, water being one of the critical areas. We did something similar on carbon emissions, something similar on women empowerment, and so forth. The baseline behind all the issue approach is that you bring stakeholders together, you let them define what is a good practice and what is not a good practice, then you codify this in a general way so business understands the meaning of it, and then you come up with a framework of engagement. And this is the framework that means business that engage, they respect not to do damage, so to speak, not to do the wrong thing, and they're willing to support, to be part of the solution. So this is really our business model at its core, very simple, and we grow at the rate of 100 companies per month now, roughly, so there's huge demand. We're very proud that we are supported in all parts of the world, from China to Brazil, from Argentina to Iceland. So it's a strictly non-political, non-ideologically, strictly practical approach. Currently, something phenomenal is happening because this agenda is going mainstream as I speak. I should explain we launched 2 sister initiatives. One is with business schools. It's called PRIME, Principles for Responsible Management Education. That's where MBA curriculum increasingly takes on these issues of sustainability and makes it part of education so that future business leaders don't have to be converted. They already are clean and mean. And the other initiative is called PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment. It's now based in London with more staff members than we currently have in New York, engaging institutional investors, asset owners, asset managers, 1,200 of them. And their mission is to integrate into investment analysis and decision-making non-financial issues, recognizing that increasingly non-traditional financial issues are actually material for long-term financial success. And there's currently a flurry of really great activities going on. There's no one single framework in existence yet. Many systems are proprietary because investors obviously also advertise that they have superior recipes for sustainable investment. So the market is really competing currently on the ESG front, which we think is wonderful. My prediction is the following, and I'm convinced it is true. So long as the world stays peaceful and open, meaning there's a commitment that entrepreneurship and best practices can travel fast and wide, so long as the world is committed to non-discrimination in trade and investment, very, very important. So long as the world stays open and cherishes performance, there is a race to the top. And ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues increasingly are part of the success criteria. Our mantra now basically says long-term financial success increasingly goes hand in hand with good environmental stewardship, social responsibility, and good governance. If a company fails on only one of these 3 pillars, it may be financially successful in the short run, but it cannot assure safeguard success over time. And this is a fundamental recognition that is only now sinking in. Don't ask me why it took so long. It's basically despite maybe the financial crisis helped a little bit on the risk side. Auto is another story. So this is how the compact moves forward. Currently, what is booming currently, just yesterday we had a huge event in Istanbul by my colleagues, the first annual conference of Business for Peace, outlining what can businesses do in conflict-affected countries or countries where governance is failing. And it's amazing how the uptake of this idea is spreading around the world. My reading, by the way, is that many business leaders feel the world is moving in the wrong direction. Nationalism, populism, inward orientation is on the rise. This is all a potential threat to going global. So more and more businesses are willing to counter-invest in the positive force. Secondly, so long as transparency is on the rise, and transparency will continue to rise, like technological change, I believe it to be irreversible, unless, of course, something major interruptive will happen. But transparency, like technological change, is irreversible. Therefore, it makes increasingly sense to be proactive. Hiding anything, even deep down in the supply chain, just doesn't pay off anymore. It will come out one way or the other. So why wait until disaster hits you? It's much smarter to be proactive and name the problems what they are, and then explore what can be done. And a third mega trend, which I'm convinced is true too, few observers have noticed, but it's very fundamental. Foreign direct investment itself, the major vehicle through which business goes global, has changed fundamentally in its nature. Until not too long ago, it really used to be about sourcing cheap input into your value chain to produce something which in your home market then you sell or you create, recreate. Today, a growing share of foreign direct investment is really about making a bet in the future of a country, because economic growth, like technology, has migrated to the east and to the south. And the next 1 billion middle class is not in the north, it's in the east and in the south. That means for companies to invest in emerging markets. They are stakeholders over time. And when there are constraints, be it diseases, be it lack of educated people, they need to grow their business, be it corruption, it is a systemic growth barrier. There's an interest to overcome it. So the whole incentive structure for engagement has fundamentally changed and is very favorable for engagement now. And we see this manifested in the growth of our country networks, which are basically booming in all emerging markets. And I think there's a fourth fundamental trend going on, which is trickier, but it's a fact of life. As business power has been growing, of course, so is rightly the expectation about responsibility. But there's another trend going on. The definition of what is public and what is private is increasingly fussy. And the private sector increasingly has a stake in public policy issues. I give you two examples. The air and water, the ultimate public goods, which is a human right for everybody to enjoy, increasingly has to be priced in one way or the other. Global warming, it calls for a price on carbon. There's a big stake the private sector has in it. And just last week, we convened a climate summit, and my office was responsible for the private sector engagement. We had several hundred CEOs there who stepped forward, making the business case for carbon pricing, recognizing that a systemic change needs to happen. And unless, the incentive structure is changed, we won't get there. Secondly, water scarcity, biggest issue in so many countries around the world. It's also an essential input for business to function. Almost any type of business needs water, like human beings, like plants, like animals. So water scarcity forces on you a way to find solutions. So in short, I believe there are big trends in play which suggest that this agenda is bound to grow in relevance, so long as the world stays open and peaceful. There are many dark clouds on the horizon on that front, with populism on the rise, nationalism, inward orientation, and there's always a risk of big disruptions out there. We live in a highly, highly volatile world where there's also a need to restate the fundamentals of what holds the world together. And we believe that the Compact's mission now increasingly is also to restore the basic trust in relationships between countries and nations, and business-to-business relations are one way for making it happen. Commerce trade and investment used to be seen in 1945 as the twin side of peace and security in the idealized version of the UN creation. We feel strongly we need to revive this to make sure the world stays multilateral, open, and puts an emphasis on collaboration to counter many of the negative trends that we see happening right now. So we look into the future actually with a lot of opportunities, and we are actually now facing the luxury of having to make choices, where to set priorities. We have big arguments within the office. Should we focus on climate change, water? Is it the social issues? No, it's anti-corruption, the biggest corrosive force of all. Then in terms of regions, we are very strong in China and other emerging giants, but how does this all fit together globally? How do we support smooth? So it's an exciting approach, and for the UN it's also very important because in 1945, business was firmly behind the UN, the International Chamber of Commerce, General Electric, the chair of the US chamber was in San Francisco. Then came the Cold War. The UN had to be neutral. The UN forgot how to work with business. Mutual suspicion built up. There was no skill set in the UN to actually work with business. So through the Global Compact, we also opened the door for the United Nations to re-establish a relationship with the private sector based on values and principles, but encouraging increasingly the practical solution. So we collaborate and work with many UN entities, from UNICEF to UN Women, the Rome-based organizations, Food and Agriculture, Education, UNESCO, and we support them in building their own capacity to better leverage their own institutional advantage to work with the private sector. Because solving public goods is increasingly in the private interest. It's this overlap of public and private interest that creates the business case for engagement and that supports the ESG value proposition. When Michael Porter came up with shared value, we congratulated him because it's basically a narrow interpretation of the Global Compact, which actually Kofi Annan said already in 1999, a Global Compact of shared values with emphasis on S. So it's not only the value creation, but also the values. But it's a very helpful concept because it expresses a similar intention. So, and we are very confident that this agenda is of growing importance. It also means for students that one has to learn to look at the agenda from both sides, the public angle, the public goods angle, understanding what's priority, and from the private angle, and then see where's the overlap and where's the winning solution from which side. It complicates matters, so the old simple line, public and private, doesn't necessarily hold anymore. It's a bit more unwieldy, but it's also full of rich surprises, and it allows for much more innovation to flow on both sides. It was probably too long, huh?
No. I could listen to this all night, primarily because it does fill me with some optimism. That we are moving in the right direction in the private sector. However, if I were the CEO of a large multinational company, and let's hope that I never am, particularly if you're shareholders in that company, I would want some metrics.
Yep.
Okay? It's one thing to say that no one makes money in the long term without investment in the environment, that no one makes money in the long term without serious anti-corruption protections and labor protections and so forth. But an awful lot of money can be made in the short term.
Yes.
So if I'm a CEO and I'm beholden to my board and beholden to my shareholders and beholden to my share price, what's the case that you can make to me from the perspective of metrics?
The first question I would ask, and I do ask that many CEOs, is what company do you want to lead? Do you want a company that is based on sound ethics and there to stay for the long run and grow stronger over time? Or is it a volatile business where you're happy to get rich quickly and then sail out or off? If it's the latter, then you're absolutely right. And the fact of the matter is that despite the financial crisis, financial markets have not become more long-term oriented. There's a great story out by Dominique, the CEO of McKinsey, with whom we are working in some of these areas on short-termism, long-termism. And the sad truth is that asset managers in particular continue in their short frenzy of short-term returns and quarterly, hourly, second-wise. So it's true that these trends are still there and very dominant and very important, but you'll be amazed how many companies increasingly are learning the lesson. Because I can also give you many examples of big companies that ran into big problems. And many companies learn through big disasters that happen. Yeah? Look at DuPont, look at Siemens, and I could go on. These are all global brands which had to learn the hard way, where the top management now is either behind bars or otherwise, and I know some of them. And they totally changed their business culture because they decided we want to be a long-term successful company. We want to be on the innovation side. And so it's a question of who do you want to be. Yes, the world is still very, very short-term, and it's the biggest barrier in our mind, the short-termism, especially of the asset managers. By the way, asset owners, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, they have in their constitution to be long-term guardians of entrusted savings for the next generation, but they conveniently outsource that responsibility to the asset managers. So that's one of the crux dilemmas, how to break that between asset owners and asset managers, because that's where the main leverage is. And I think it's also a question of the future of capitalism and its future orientation. Capitalism in historical terms has always gone through changes, industrialization phases and different forms. There are competing forms of markets out there. And don't forget, financial crisis was almost celebrated in India and China because they pointed the finger at the US, basically saying, look, I told you, this type of capitalism is not working, ours is working. So be aware, state capitalism and other forms of market orientation are out there. And so it's a whole ecosystem of competing forms of markets. And I guess what we try to do is chart a middle ground of, market approaches that are sustainable, that are grounded in sound principles, and that also tackle some of the big challenges. Because on the risk side, on the systemic risk side, you can also speculate, but no escaping. Climate change is a reality. It won't go away. Yeah? So we have to deal with it one way or the other. It will hit us one way or the other. The demographic time bomb in African countries, in India, with young unemployed people, it will hit us one way or the other. The threat of diseases we hear recently, we're involved now in Ebola heavily, we mobilize heavily, but experts have long predicted pandemics is one of the consequences. So the whole profile of global risks has actually changed in such a way that increasingly puts a premium on preparedness, resilience, and actually investing in sound ethics. So companies which are only in the quick thing, I hope are on the losing end over time and will increasingly be squeezed out by the more forward-looking, resilient organizations. I hope I'm right.
I certainly hope you're right. Let's talk a little bit about one of the 10 principles, and this is the principle that supports the right to collective bargaining. Now, the right to collective bargaining is under an enormous amount of pressure in the United States right now, and has been for many years. It's never taken hold in many parts of the world. And when we look at companies, I hate to single out companies, but since I use their products, let's talk about a company that begins with the letter A and is located in a quaint part of California called Cupertino, right? There's a reason that they manufacture in China and not in the United States. Or in a Scandinavian country, for instance, where collective bargaining rights are much more rigorously respected and supported. If I'm Apple, short of a media black eye, right, which they've received several of, what motivation do I have to implement in my policies and operations that particular principle of support for collective bargaining?
It's a big issue in the US with many companies, in particular in the US. However, the answer is very simple. We have currently 350 American corporations, I believe, actively involved, and I guess 2/3 of them are non-unionized. We promote decent workplace as an overarching theme. The principles are given to us by the international definitions of the ILO. It's the fundamental principles and rights at work, signed on by all governments. We never ever interfere with national legislation of how it's interpreted. It's a big legal argument in the US how the interpretation of these principles are translated. We never ever interfere there. So we are not saying you have to unionize. Yeah? That's not what the principle says. The principle says recognize that unionization and freedom and collective bargain is a basic right which people ought to have. So it's a human right enshrined in the fundamental principles and rights at work. So it means on that score we are very pragmatic and we never ever discriminate against one or the other. And it's true there have been efforts to use the compact one way or the other, but we have to refer such situations to the ILO, which then refers it back to its governing body, which in turn then reflects the reality of the world where industrial policies is a strictly national prerogative. So at its core, what we promote is not the individual principle as such, but the idea of decent workplaces. And I give you a great example from China. I was recently there with a newly appointed CEO of a major manufacturing company who was challenged from the audience. How can you support a global compact in China when everybody knows there are no real free trade unions? His reply, and I really have to give him 5 blue stars for that, he said, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm running my company and I'm encouraging all my staff, my employees, to self-organize because I want to have the voice of the workers. I want their input. And I'm establishing this and this council. So this is how I'm running my company. End of the story. And I know that his company is a very big one, and so are many others. In other words, you can, even in difficult situation, in Saudi Arabia, you can make progress on women empowerment within your companies, and we have great examples. So in any place of the earth, within your own company, you can actually advance the spirit of the principles. But we would never point the finger at one country and say, you are not endorsing or ratifying this particular convention. This is not our job. Our job is to identify best practices that advance the idea, in this case, of decent workplace conditions. And let me say something provocative, because I know this may sound harsh, but being an engineer myself and having lived for many years in many places around the world, never forget that in many developing countries, having a sweatshop is 100 times better than having no job. So I'm actually a strong defender of sweatshops, provided there is a strong commitment to improve conditions over time. No country on earth has found richness except those who sit on gold or oil all of a sudden. It has to be earned. If you look through industrialization in this country or in Europe, it has been a really dirty struggle. And when you see poverty firsthand and the absence of any opportunity, any way to start is a good way to start. But then you have to strive for improvement, continuous improvement. So don't stay static at your comparative advantage and make a national competitiveness out of your cheap labor pool that condemns you to stagnation. But grow up the ladder as fast as possible. And it's the only way for poor people to escape poverty. And this is where globalization has made the biggest contribution to reducing poverty in human history. By far, several 100 million people now have a prospect of surviving and having a halfway decent life, which they didn't have 20 years ago. And I attribute this to business going global. So,
would you extend that argument about working conditions? The idea that, okay, you're not going to start at the very, very top, but you're going to, commit yourself to moving forward, increasing wages, increasing safety. Would you extend that logic to something like carbon emissions. And you know what we've seen, of course, in the developing economies, China in particular, but now increasingly India, we've seen just vast outputs of carbon and pollutants of all kinds, including heavy metals and so on.
I think on carbon the story is somewhat different. Humanity never faced a challenge as we're facing now. The air doesn't respect national boundaries. It's proven now that often those countries least contributed to the warm-up, build-up, now are affected most deeply. It's not just the small island countries which disappear from the surface of this globe, but also in African countries where drought is now increasingly linked to. Here, I think we face a fundamental challenge how to price externalities. And the argument that as a free marketeer I would make here is simply, if you don't cost externalities, then the market is grossly distorted to begin with. You can argue that not pricing carbon is the biggest distortion of markets ever, because it's now proven that it causes huge damage. So how can you allow damage to happen without having to pay for it? So it's wrong. So our very system needs to be corrected. That's why we need to put the price on carbon, and arguably the higher the better. And that's what we launched last week, and I think it was a historic turning point. We're very proud of this, that we won over many companies to underwrite, at least in principle, the idea of carbon pricing. The devil is in the detail, because companies, of course, invest in all sides at the same time. They want to be on the winning side, whatever the outcome is. But we have some very tough criteria now. We have a leadership platform called Carbon Pricing Champions, and it has 3 tough criteria. First of all, of course, you measure. That goes without saying. Many others are doing that already, and it's required increasingly. But second, you also set an internal price for carbon and greenhouse gas emissions that is high enough to materially affect your investment decisions, meaning you increasingly go for low carbon investments instead of polluting, dirty, fossil. Thirdly, and even more challenging, you come clean on government affairs. Because it's well known that even companies who make great advertisement, great progress on green, low-tech, high-tech products, at the same time often outsource government affairs to others, who then in turn block everything that could advance, say, carbon pricing. And we are asking business now, get clean on government affairs, align it with your sustainability goals, and that movement was launched last week. In the initial phase, we only have 30 big CEOs, but we know of 100 more are currently discussing it at board level. It's a fundamental decision, and we are confident that this will grow over time, because putting a price on carbon is the only way to massively change the systems. You can make great progress, and we should do so wherever we can, you know, from circular economy to everything else. But to change the whole investment infrastructure on energy, on transportation, and so forth, you also need the incentive structure to reflect the true costs. And so I would argue, as a free marketeer, as a conservative person in this case, put a price on carbon is the only way to ensure that markets actually can compete fairly.
Let's change focus a little bit to, I'll put it in crass terms. When a company joins the Global Compact, there's doubtlessly an initial period of enthusiasm. There's some positive PR, they put it in their shareholder reports, the CEO does a little speech, everybody's happy. Somewhere between joining and getting delisted,
Right.
something must happen or fail to happen within that company. Do you have a sense of what that something typically is?
Yes, I think we actually know it now. I could draw now a curve, which is actually quite relevant for investors. It's true that initially companies may get a small boost, you know, branding, staff morale. It feels good, it is good, and it should be good. It should empower employees. But then when you really try to build the systems, the incentive structure, and you want to roll out your commitment through your value chain, supply chain, subsidiaries, you have costs. And many companies then actually giving up. Investors are getting impatient. They're saying, where's the return? Actually, if anything, it costs more than we get out of it. And then many companies drop out, unfortunately. But those which stay in and which make the investment over time and make sure their operations are genuinely compatible with good ethics, environmental stewardship, they will reach a tipping point where all of a sudden they realize actually their own organization is fit to mitigate risks. They're aware of it, they can anticipate it, they can pre-invest in it, and they're also top line on spotting new opportunities, because most of the new growth opportunities come out of this domain. And as of this point, the valuation will go up. But the tragedy is that it takes time. Big organizations to change is not a small task. So imagine a big integrated global corporation with only 50 country operations, 50 country CEOs talking different language, embedded in different culture. To get a new culture embedded there is a huge undertaking and takes time. So our prediction is those companies which stay in it could be anything between, depending on size, complexity, 3 to 5 years until this inflection point is reached, but then it goes upwards. We launched recently our own stock index, the Global Compact 100. It's alive now on Bloomberg, based on this curve. And guess what? The 4th consecutive year, it has been outperforming all comparative indices. So fingers crossed, because if this index now is being embraced big time, and according to Bloomberg it will, because timing is right, it will just help to make the business case, yeah, because we need the proof for that.
I think it's important for those investors out there that we say that past performance is no clear prediction of future gains.
Right.
Okay. Well, I found it extremely interesting, and I wonder if you've noticed any patterns within the body of companies, obviously the vast majority of companies that stick with it versus the ones that don't. Is it companies of certain sizes? Is it are publicly held companies more likely to stay with it than privately held companies? Are companies in certain countries more likely to stick with it than in other countries?
On average, large companies find it easier to implement systems of management, apparently, so they have a slight edge, so to speak, in internalizing non-financial issues. They have the analytical, the strategic, and operational capacity to implement that effectively. Small and medium-sized companies often act out of their owner, who can and often does very well understand these issues and often has equally good, if not better, performance, but find it difficult to connect with it on an ongoing basis. In terms of geography, it's a very mixed picture. Our observation is the more integrated in the global value chain a company is, the more sensitive they are on these issues. If you're a very sheltered company in one country, your incentive to learn about environmental, social governance issues is fairly limited because you're sheltered by one regulatory environment, and all you need to do is have good relations with one government. Then you have your license to operate. But when you go global, it means going local everywhere. You're facing many different regulatory environments, many different social challenges, and then the learning comes in. Yes, I need a framework, and it helps me to have robust systems in place. Otherwise, I can't build a brand and solid operations over time. State-owned versus privately is a hot subject. There are plus and minus on both sides. It's a tricky issue, grossly under-researched, by the way. I wish there were more analytical work done in this area. My own observation, working in China for 15 years now, it's phenomenal how state-owned companies can make enormous progress. They're commanded to implement now, pollution measures, and it's happening. Just like this, unimaginable here. It's the business case which makes things happen. Think also of Sweden. There are many countries in between with mixed models. In Sweden, half the companies publicly listed are actually publicly owned, but the public ownership is such that they fully entrust the management to the private scrutiny. So it's publicly owned but privately run. then also think of the many other forms of governance that are out there. Many big companies are actually foundation-based. Think of the Tatars, great companies in India with really phenomenal performance in these areas. They are foundation-based, and there are similar companies in the US, in Germany, and elsewhere, foundation-based. Then there's the whole co-op movement, and then there's the whole social enterprise concept, which speaks it to the micro level, to the mixed forms of governance. So I think this whole ownership question is very important. There are very influential papers suggesting that if you're too much in the short-term shareholder grip, okay, then you find it more difficult to be long-term oriented, because shareholders demand quick returns. They insist on high quarterly returns. And one of our working groups now with investors is on what can companies do in order to minimize that risk of short-termism. And they came up with 3 strategies for companies. One is called coping. You basically tell investors that you're reaping big benefits from long-term investments, even if it's not quite true in the short run, but you're telling them that. Efficiency gains, environmental. The second one is called shifting. You try to get rid of the impatient short-term capital and replace it with more patient long-term capital. Some companies can do it, but only many can't do it. They depend on the short-term shareholder model. And then there's the systemic change, which we are working on with PRI and many others to shift the valuation. And there are many ways and approaches. It starts with tools, with valuation, incentives, and so forth. It's a very big challenge, and I would Dominic Burton, whom I quoted before, did a really great study on that, on short-termism, and it's not easy to break through that. It's not easy, but it's not easy.
No. Have you seen any shifts in thinking about ways that CEOs are themselves compensated? Because it strikes me that in many markets, the CEOs, because they receive gazillions of stock options, are severely biased toward that short-term share valuation view, whereas countries which do not compensate CEOs that way might be more easily able to adapt to these paradigms.
There's much analysis out there which basically supports what you're saying. And I just want to quote one company here. I usually don't quote them, but the world's biggest shipping company, which is a Danish, called Maersk. It's 105 years old. Guess how many CEOs they had in their history? 4. Well, it's a gross exaggeration.
Is one of them immortal?
Yeah, kind of. But it speaks for the long-term range thinking in many of the business assumptions. Yes, the incentive structure is perverse in many ways, no doubt. It actually rewards short-term winner-takes-it-all behavior, and thereby actually leads to risk-taking, which one can argue, once damage happens, is irresponsible. Yeah? It's a systemic issue.
Let's turn to the concept of multi-stakeholder engagement. And this has been something that the UN has always talked about, but certainly in the case of the Global Compact, in the case of the UN Academic Impact Program, which engages more than 1,000 universities around the world, and in some other instances, there have been much more concrete efforts to bring non-state actors on board. Is it your sense that this is where the UN is going in general, or are we seeing perhaps 2 steps forward, 1 step backward kind of a situation?
It's a difficult question. Basically, I do believe that at this juncture in history, non-state actors, in particular business, more probably than any other type of actors, educators, yes, and investors, they are ahead of the curve from governments. They are more global. They are more aware and more willing to tackle public good challenges. Nation states, this is the dilemma, I think, currently, are becoming more national in their definition of national interest, despite the fact that global challenges increasingly affect national interests. But I believe there's kind of almost a retreat from the original multilateralism a little bit on many fronts. You can see it on trade, on many other areas. Whereas business is generally global, so is education, so is investment. They have the national boundaries still matter a lot, obviously, for regulatory and other issues. But in terms of their outlook and their perspective, they look at markets in terms of purchasing power, irrespective of passports behind it. And we have seen it in Rio de Janeiro, where we organized Rio Plus 20. We had 3,000 companies there for a whole week. The biggest ever gathering we organized, the Corporate Sustainability Forum. We launched 200 new initiatives, and it was a firework of voluntary engagement by the private sector, really a firework. And it showed that in many regards, the private sector is actually ahead of governments. We have to be careful in how we put this. We are saying now, we work with the private sector, say on carbon pricing, to encourage governments, to encourage them to be bold and outward oriented. But yes, I believe that non-state actors increasingly have a propensity to be part of the solution on global public good dilemmas. And that is good once we learn how to leverage their engagement to ultimately also encourage nation-states, governments, because it's still a world run by the nation-state system. The Westphalia system still is the dominant one. And if the tough things come together, as we see in the Ukraine or elsewhere, when the moment security issues come up, everybody's hiding behind the national agenda, and ultimately, political power trumps, unfortunately, markets. So commerce for peace is often trumped by the wrong forces. I would argue, and I'm the chair of something called the Northeast Asian Forum, our 3 networks, Korea, Japan, and China, and there where business meets with academia, supported, and they have a keen interest to build mutual understanding, and they're very nervous that the respective political leadership, is actually playing a whole other song, which is very dangerous and could potentially disrupt everything. I'm actually telling business leaders these days, you're sleeping behind the wheel. Because if you assume the next 20 years will be like the last 20 years have been, you're wrong. Because the political risks out there are so imminent currently that any major disaster easily could disrupt the whole practice behind global integration. Then all the value concept notion would go down the drain. Huge depression would obviously follow, and it would be catastrophic for everybody. The degree of interdependence we already live in, we don't even realize it. But no single city on this globe could survive on its own anymore. And it's not just the communication connectivity, it's the material connectivity, it's energy, it's food, it's clothing, it's everything. But the human mind hasn't caught up yet with the degree of interdependence we already live in. So, and this is why I'm so worried currently when I see, for example, in Europe, how the extreme forces from the old ideologies are coming back, be it from the extreme right or the extreme left, or how nationalists now are marching onwards in some places, claiming the high banner. Very dangerous and totally in disconnect with the reality of today's world. But this is how human nature, unfortunately, is. But we should be aware of how political power is exercised, and we should actually use business more to become statesmen, to argue for peace, to argue for commerce, for fairness, for rule-based approach, and yes, for making progress on some of the most burning problems we are facing. And that's where business has a lot to contribute in terms of know-how, in terms of technology, in terms of practical reach.
Before we turn to questions from the audience, we've certainly taken note of some changes in the Global Compact. When the initiative began, it clearly was for the private sector. It was for-profit corporations. But when you look at the roster of participating members now, you see non-governmental organizations, and you also see several hundred universities around the world. Could you tell us a little bit about how that move took place from pretty much a private sector organization to one that's much more multi-stakeholder in its
Well,
orientation.
just to correct you slightly,
Thank you.
actually, from the beginning, we were multi-stakeholder oriented. On our board, from the beginning, we had civil society representatives and labor representatives, but business was in the majority. So we called the compact always business-led, but multi-stakeholder. And and that hasn't really changed, but the numbers have grown, and some special engagement platforms have emerged, such as with business schools, cities, and now also with civil society, a more focused strategic engagement, simply because the numbers grew out of control. Yeah? And we have 4,000 non-business participants currently worldwide. So we have introduced also quality checks now to make sure that those that are engaged actually are doing something that advances the cause and are not just free riding by signing on once and then not doing anything. So there's a bit of cleaning up going on now. Very important, but we also always appreciated the relationship with civil society, despite the fact that we had, say, ideological arguments, and that's fair and good. But NGOs have been very important as, always challenging business to do more. And if it hadn't been for NGOs, then many of these trends wouldn't have happened as fast as they did. Yeah? As watchdogs, very important. But also on the implementation side, in many countries, civil society organizations are actually also the UN's #1 partner in dealing on the ground with health issues, humanitarian issues, and increasingly in partnerships. What is changing, I believe, is that this whole agenda of collaboration is being professionalized now. 15 years ago, the term multi-stakeholder was still an exotic term a little bit. It was
I try to use it at least 10 times a day.
Okay. Now I think it has gone mainstream. Everybody's in the business of partnering, and it has been professionalized. NGOs have become very smart and professional and almost business-oriented in how to do it. And we all have to learn how to successfully build and manage partnerships. On that issue, one development that I alluded to earlier, what has happened in that space too is that more and more companies and civil society and other stakeholders realize it's great to work on one project and to implement something and to have impact and to be successful. But if you really want to transform a systemic challenge, you need collaboration on a much larger scale. And this is where our issue platform approach, I believe, is so revolutionary, because it allows for scalable engagement. So it's not just 1, 5, or 10 companies and 5 NGOs. It's a mass movement in a country that makes sure that, say, women empowerment becomes a dominant national force and not just a little project that one proudly showcases as an achievement. And this collaborative and going to scale is very, very important in many domains. Paul Polman last week with us, when he launched the palm oil and deforestation, it's a significant move to go to scale, because one company alone can't do it. It's a industry-wide challenge. So only by winning over all competitors into the same mold can you tackle that. And this is the new collaborative dimension of also B2B relationships, very, very important. Sometimes we are telling business the era of differentiation is over. It's time to get serious and to collaborate. We still encourage business, of course, to compete for best performance on these areas. Yeah? It's the nature of the beast. That's the beauty of business, competitive, so they want to be better. And that's great. But when it comes to collaboration, you need a different incentive thinking, because you want to solve a common problem, which crosses the whole sector, and maybe even several sectors. And then you need to agree to co-invest and to be only one of many partners. And then the benefits accrue to all those.
I mean, you're describing something that's a little bit like mutual disarmament.
Yes.
Which didn't work so well for nation states. Perhaps we'll see something better in the corporate sector. My last question comes back again to, we are a university here at Fairleigh Dickinson, and we have looked at this thing called the Global Compact, and we've taken note that there are several hundred university members, and we have included in our strategic plan for 2015 to 2000, well, it's a 5-year plan. Don't make me do the math. In our new strategic plan, to do a feasibility study of joining the Global Compact ourselves.
Wonderful.
As we do this, do you have any advice for us? Do you have any thoughts for not only Fairleigh Dickinson University, but for other universities with whom we work?
Well, Jonas Hörtl is here, is heading our academic platform. We support.
And we are, of course, members of
yes,
Prime.
So far, our specialty is business schools more because academic impact covers the wider field. My advice would be pick one big theme which is important to you, where you think with your enthusiasm of your students you can actually make a difference. Maybe it's linked to the local community, I'm not sure, but not necessarily. Usually environmental issues are easier ones because they're direct, and there's always need for improvement. Energy efficiency, it's a never-ending quest for improvement. What we demand now from non-business participants is to actually show every year one concrete, tangible progress, and we leave that up to you. But we would highly welcome this, and it would be so much in the spirit of FDU's engagement with the United Nations, which is so much appreciated and cuts across so many different domains. So that's great news.
Thank you. I'd like to turn over the program now to Ms. Sarah Horn, who is Assistant Director for Global Learning here at Fairleigh Dickinson, and she will conduct the Q&A. I would ask that all questions end with a question mark, and that you try to keep that question brief so many will have an opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much. Just real quick, the ground rules before we start. Please raise your hand. We will call on you. Our microphone runner, our student Batul, will come to you, give you the microphone. Please keep it to one question. Okay, let's start.
If a company was under your compact or your program and they were following the rules and they acquired another company, would they be forced to immediately get that company that they acquired to follow the rules, or would there be a grace period?
We assume that once a company joins through acquisitions, they will continue their engagement and they will actually extend the commitment to instantly to the acquired company. Absolutely. And there's a historical track record. We're actually quite proud that in many acquisitions we have played a role at least, because the match of corporate cultures is actually quite important for successful mergers. It's one of the key issues for success or failure. And we know of many companies, for example, when they went into China, for example, and they started to collaborate with Chinese companies, they gave a premium on companies which were in the compact because it was easier to communicate on basic issues. But yes, absolutely.
You mentioned that you're trying to change cultures in a lot of these businesses. So I was wondering how you respectfully do that in, I guess, countries where their culture isn't congruent with that of the global impact. For example, you were mentioning women's rights. So let's say if the culture doesn't accept women's rights, how do you get the business to accept that culture?
Yeah, it's the globalization's biggest challenge, how to respect human rights everywhere and how to make sure that human rights are also universally respected. The argument, the way we do it and the way business understands it by and large is that within its own operations, they actually are in charge. They can set the ground rules and they can create an enabling environment where women are not discriminated against. They can take precautionary measures to show all the cultural and religious sensitivities required to meet local conditions and yet uphold. And we have great examples on that, on the exactly women empowerment. And I quoted one country before, but that is just one country. The beauty with business is that within its own operations, they are in charge, so they can set the ground rules, and whether it's and so that's where we encourage business to move ahead. And the idea then is to create little islands of where principles are respected, and then connecting the islands so they can learn from each other and they can grow stronger. And then the theory, in theory, is that over time, these islands become a momentum that over time, will set the dominant tone in the country.
Hi. My question was, do companies have to meet certain standards in order to be able to join, or do you accept any company?
The entry bar is currently a little bit leveled up. There are two conflicting theories, and frankly, we are not sure. What really matters when a company joins is that the leadership knows about what it means and they have a serious intent of engagement. Now, how do you check a serious intent? It's very difficult. Yeah? So we do this through pre-discussions, through sharing, and once they sign a letter publicly, when a CEO signs something, it has usually a meaning, and it goes through the legal department often. So we have arguments with the legal department. Some of them argue we still have issues here in this domain, so we are not yet ready to join. Yeah? We are then saying, look, the compact is a learning platform, yeah? And once you join, the commitment you really make is continuous improvement. It means you want to be better every year. And this year's performance should be better than last year's performance, and you want next year's performance to be better than this year, continuous performance improvement. So we basically encourage all companies that have a serious intent. But that's difficult to quantify, very difficult. And since we're on this subject, I have another interesting analogy. It's like when people get married and they pledge to each other, to be faithful until death parts them. And it works sometimes, but not always. So divorce rates, you can again analyze by country, but so it's a trust-based relationship that depends on the pledge. And the pledge, the commitment, and economist Schelling wrote a beautiful piece on the nature of commitments, and once it's ritualized, it has actually a deep meaning, provided the procedures are then in place to carry it through, which we have now through the delisting, among others. But basically, we encourage all companies to join over time, but we want them to have a serious intent and to actually stay engaged. It's very sad to welcome companies and then they leave again 2 years later because they don't do their communication and progress.
Maybe over on this side, in the blue shirt.
The blue Fairleigh Dickinson
Yes.
University shirt.
Yes, I should have pointed that
Nicely
out.
done.
Seeing that you have several analyses on the current globalization, what do you believe is the key component to integrating the global economy?
For nation states to rediscover that the common future depends on the well-being of every member of the international community, that this is not a race to the bottom where national interests are in competition with everybody else. I hate the term national competitiveness, for example. It's companies that should compete, not nation states. So, and the realization that the world is so deeply interconnected today that it just makes common sense to collaborate, and rocking the boat will be destructive for everybody who sits on this globe. So a kind of a reality check with global interdependence where we are and where technology has brought us. That's my wish, yeah? And it has to start with politicians and the goddamn populism that is so widespread now, yeah? It's really, really scary. Especially, and I hate to say this because I was born in Germany, but I left in '82 and I have searched for many years about understanding the past. And I'm shocked when the young generation now forgets about history. And this is the nature of the beast of human beings. We have to relearn the lessons again and again. But in the case of global interdependence, I think the evidence is so overwhelming that we almost need a mass movement for the voice of reason to be communicated to politicians and not do a beggar thy neighbor approach, a very narrow national interest only approach, but recognize that the national interest increasingly depends on the well-being of the global community as a whole.
In the back there.
I want to ask the question about Europe and the U.S. the sanction on the Russian. Why now they against the Russian is a little like back to the Cold War. So what do you think about that?
Well, it's very sad. We are shocked. We have a good network in Russia and in the Ukraine. Currently, our Ukraine network is in disaster humanitarian mode. Same happened, by the way, in Syria and Iraq. I talked about nationalism before. Clearly, one form of nationalism is currently being on display big time, which is very threatening and very worrisome. None of the business leaders involved want that, wish that, the serious ones. Sanctions are a convenient way of punishment, but often hit the wrong people. Because those in power always find a way around it, and usually sanctions tragically reinforce those who arguably are making the wrong decisions because they use it as a pretext to further justify their populist stand. My good friend Sir Mark Moody Stewart, who is the chair of our foundation, former CEO of Shell, who has written extensively on the subject of sanctions, I would really recommend that. He's very much against sanctions as a matter of principle. But then history also shows us that in the end, it's politics which trumps markets, unfortunately. One example, in Germany in 1914, the German industrialists tried to convince Kaiser Wilhelm not to go to war because they were concerned that newly found competitiveness will be undermined. Stupid Kaiser Wilhelm wouldn't listen. Everything got destroyed. So peace, collaboration is the fundamental precondition for markets to flourish. But then market forces are an enormously powerful way of connecting people, nations, and cultures. And working with them to advance public goods is one way to counter such forces. But sadly, you know, national politics and traditional concepts of power still have to say.
Over there in the gray shirt, in the middle.
Does the Global Compact have anything to do with the mass media, such as NBC or General Electric owning the mass media, and such as social responsibility to inform people about what's actually going on?
We have a very small communications team, very small, and we wish we had more resources to work more on the social media side. We are fairly weak there. Any idea you students could have or help us there would really be appreciated. We have a great head of media, but she's one person. Yeah. So she has to do the traditional work of press releases and so forth. And then there's the whole, would be great if you had to look into this and maybe made it a project. Yeah? That would be wonderful. We are weak there.
I mean, this does raise an interesting question that never occurred to me. You know, when I think of corporate members of the Global Compact, I think of, you know, industrial companies, and I think of chemical companies.
No.
I don't think of media companies.
We work, well, currently we have a big project, for example, with Richard Edelman, the biggest privately in New York, and we work with many of the media companies. We have also with the service companies, from McKinsey to Deloitte, Boston Consulting, and so forth. No, but also media companies. But it's very hard on the communication side, where social media then comes in. Yeah? Companies use their own channels, obviously, so we encourage that, and that is done in not in an organized way, but on our own operation. Say we had last week this big climate summit. Yeah, we got some good press, yes, but because we're a big part of a bigger alignment. But by and large, it would be great to have a much stronger social media dimension in that. My people always tell me we are weak there.
Do you tweet?
I am always saying, don't quote me, I'm always saying I don't tweet, I think.
Into the camera, speak into the camera.
No, I don't tweet. I like to think. But I have to be careful with such statements, I was told. But I'm basically a content man and more a philosopher and more long range. And I find it, but my young people are much fitter on that. But we should, and I should. I know.
I have a question, Georg, picking up on your point about how governments are often way behind businesses, and that's been my observation, having spent a lot of time with a very enlightened major multinational for years. I know you have to be scrupulous about having many opinions that could be construed as political in a national setting, but in the United States, we have an awful lot of evidence that a lot of our political forces have been arrayed against looking at things like pricing carbon and that sort of thing. Yes. Do you have any suggestions, if you need to, off the record, about what we as citizens can do to exert a little more pressure in the direction of more enlightened public policies?
Oh, that would be so wonderful. Well, look, I have nothing to lose. I have no criminal record. I have no wealth. So I'm lucky. I'm free. So I can speak my mind. Besides, I will retire next year. So, I think it's tragic how carbon pricing has been politicized, ideologized, totally wrong, absurd. Just 2 weeks ago, I met the chair of the UK Climate Committee, Lord Deben. I was so impressed. He's a Tory, a conservative. And he gave me the great arguments that not pricing carbon is a violation of free markets, the biggest in human history. I love that argument. So, and it's very tragic that some business trade associations in this country have become basically political arms. Yeah? They are running on a partisan agenda. And I don't think it's in the service of the interest of business long range, because business wants pragmatic solutions. But then midterm elections are upcoming here, so there's always a reason to politicize everything. Yeah? It's tragic, I think. It's bad. And climate has no ideological face. Yeah? It's in the air. How can the air be ideological? It's not. Carbon doesn't smell red or black. It's carbon. So making the business case for carbon pricing and making the case either as a free marketeer, as Lord Deben so powerfully does, and I want to bring him here because it's great to have a Tory speak, to the dinosaurs who are still administering ideologies of the past. That's how I would call them. That's one way. But another way is simply a mass movement, the voice of reason. Look, it's bad. We know it's bad. And it's free. This is perverse. It's like you allow dumping toxic waste on the playground where your kids are playing.
I'm pretty sure we do that too.
Yeah, but it's wrong. And there are provisions for that. Toxic dumping is prohibited. I'm sure it is, especially on playgrounds.
This is New Jersey. It's complicated.
So unleashing something on carbon pricing would be phenomenal. And the great news from last week from Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's really courageous climate summit is that this is the single issue that has emerged, and it's coming big time, and the voice of reason has to kick in here. That would be great.
Since technological change is irreversible, how can we use technology moving forward effectively to help meet the compact principles?
Well, I'm strongly biased for technology, I must say, and you're probably, many of you are too young and you haven't lived in the 50s or in the 60s, and the enormous progress that humanity has witnessed is largely due to technology. We have to recognize this. It's the single biggest driver of productivity, but it always is a two-sided sword. Technology is a child of the human brain. It basically extends and amplifies what we can conceive and do. And it's wonderful. It's homo ludens, behind it entrepreneurship. But it can be used for good and for bad. A hammer can be used to build a house or to smash a head. And imagine of the more potent technologies we have invented. So we have to learn not to do the wrong thing or the bad thing with technology, but to employ it for the good cause. And that's where I arrive increasingly at the conclusion after really working on this for many years, that at the core of everything is really good ethics. At the core, you must have an understanding of what is right and wrong. In the absence of a moral compass, you cannot spell out what's right and wrong. So it's absolutely important to face the moral questions behind it. And even if it's tough or not easy to dig through. But technology is also progressive. And that's the beauty of human progression in that way. And it's irreversible unless major setback called cultural happens. Once it's out there, it's known, whether codified or embedded in human brains. It lives on, and it builds one on the other. So that's what I meant with irreversible, in the progression of technological change as it advances. And as it so happens in the IT industry, which arguably has been the last big generative cycle of productivity revolution, it has, of course, favored information disclosure, which comes very handy for the cause we are advocating, because disclosure reporting now is no longer costly business, it's affordable. We are now running another big campaign. It will be unveiled on 10 December when we celebrate the 10th anniversary of our 10th principle against corruption. We will challenge governments with a simple slogan which says, all public procurement must be public. In the past, many countries argued, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the institutions, we're not so nonsense. All you need is basically an iPhone. Okay? It has become so cheap to make public procurement public. It's not a question of that's thanks to technological progress. Yeah? So we can now make that call irrespective of level of development. So thanks to technology and so on. In the health domain, the enormous progress that has been made in reducing infant mortality, it's all due to progress made on the health front and so forth. So, and we have to believe in that regard. And look, energy, the renewable, what's going on in solar and so forth. It's huge and it's exciting, and that is very, very important for our future. But we need to know the moral cause and the right application. And I don't have to quote nuclear technology, which is obviously one gross example how progress can be used in both ways. But that is the tragedy of humans. I think actually we have done a Faustian deal with technology. We are bound to it. We depend on it. It's with us, whether we like it or not. We can no longer go back. It's impossible, given the number of people living on the world now. We can no longer go to a hunting existence or basic subsistence farmers. Wouldn't work anymore. So we better come to grips with it, and we have to face the moral questions behind it.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. Here in the first row?
Yeah. In a sense, we kind of dichotomize business and politics, but on another level, one of the reasons why, for instance, the climate change issue is stuck in this country is what one might call an unholy alliance between business and politics. So resolving that kind of thing, because on one side, yes, I agree with you, there's hope through business, but on the other side, isn't business really responsible for many of the issues we face today?
You're absolutely right, and that's why on the climate change side, the whole carbon pricing issue is a fairly recent phenomena. I don't want to defend now oil companies, but when oil drilling started, the world was not aware of global warming. It became a big issue recently, and the evidence that it's man-made is now overwhelming, and implications are now. And I totally agree. The lock of corporate capture of politics has been the major reason why there has been less progress. And breaking this lock, which happens, by the way, at national level through outsourced traditional trade associations, which traditionally represent old ideologies rather than the forward-looking pragmatic view. This is exactly what we are trying to break now. So the carbon pricing champions and the work we're doing with the World Bank is really aimed at breaking this apart and saying, here are companies that recognize we no longer should block climate action at national level or support dinosaur trade associations which do it on our behalf. We will divest from them. We have to form a whole new movement where those which want to come clean and align sustainability with the climate objectives also are serious on government affairs. It's a fairly recent step, and it's a big undertaking, and it's unfortunately a big challenge in all countries. The country where I happen to be born, the BDI, is very powerful. In France, in Japan, in China, the traditional industry trade associations are like traditional institutions. They're built on the past, and their procedures and thinking is informed by the past, and they're children of the Cold War. They think in ideological terms. So we have to overcome this. We have to win them over at the end of the day. We have to open them up.
Okay, final question.
Make it a good one, please.
Even though this organization is non-political and non-ideological, how exactly do you go about to advocate capitalism in nations where it's not freely practiced? Okay. So potential businessmen could have a chance.
It's a great philosophical question. I would answer with a simple thing. There's a great philosopher who is my favorite. His name is Huizinga. He's in the Middle Ages, and he wrote about Homo ludens, the playing man. And it basically is a love song to entrepreneurship in a way. And I like to believe, and I firmly believe it, that entrepreneurship, creating something, building something, is a playful way of expressing your energies and your thinking. It's basically a nice thing. Think of children, how happy they are when they discover something. This is very similar. When entrepreneurs are trying to build something, they are playing basically, you know. So it's a playground. It's and it's better than shooting or fighting, I would argue. So it's a good way of channeling creative forces. And I like to believe genuinely that entrepreneurship as an idea and as a concept is non-ideological, that's inherent to human beings. As we are born as children, we like to explore the world. We try to find out what's behind the next corner. So entrepreneurs try to experiment with ideas. They want to build or sell something which they believe has a value, and they want to test the market. So in that regard, I would say it's non-ideological. And I like to believe that to be true. Then the form of historically grown capitalism obviously varies enormously. And then you have to look into history, and you have to ask the question, why is it that a certain country is at this stage of current governance as opposed to another country? And there the answer is complex and not easy. And the global marketplace arguably helps to accelerate a shared thinking about basic norms of right and wrong. Hopefully, I like to believe it. And therefore, I would suggest that the Global Compact can and is a force for good, because it spreads the universality of some of the core values behind markets, without which they are definitely not sustainable. And that's true on the environmental front, that's true on the social front, when there's exclusion or non-involvement. It's true on the human rights front ultimately, and it's certainly true on the corruption front as well. Because markets where publicly entrusted power is grossly abused, are not productive, are not effective, do not really culture a sense of fair competition and entrepreneurship, but they express a skewed system of power which enriches a few at the expense of many. So there's no easy answer to that, and that comes back to political regime thinking, where I'm not really an expert, but I wish the world were less driven by hyper-ideologies, especially nationalism, of which I'm convinced of, can be a very destructive force, but rather by creativity, pragmatism, and practical solution finding. That would be my wish.
Thank you very much. Before we bring the evening to a close, I just have one or two small announcements to make, and you'll tell me if I forget any of them. First, we would love for you to complete our program evaluation form, which you can access by scanning the barcode on the back of the program. No, you can't do that?
The barcode is information about the UN, but it's a barcode too.
Never mind. You can scan the barcode on the back of your program for information about the UN and complete the paper form for program evaluation. Secondly, these programs do not organize themselves, so I would like to thank Sarah and the Office of Global Learning. I'd also like to thank the Metropolitan Campus Provost Office for their assistance and support in putting this program on. I'd like to draw everyone's attention to the next UN Pathways program, which will be on October 29th on the Florham campus. We will be visited by His Excellency Nasser Abdulaziz Al Nasser, who is UN High Representative for the Alliance of Civilizations. And the topic will be the UN Alliance of Civilizations Gateway to World Peace. We will be arranging some transportation from the Metropolitan campus to the Florham campus, so keep an eye on your email for that purpose. Anything else? Then please join me in thanking George Kell for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much.